I can't stop and notice at the background is it's one of the work of
One of
art
our
from your
banners.
project.
Yeah, we made this one at the anti-COP in at the beginning of the month.
Right,
It
yeah.
says
What does it mean? What's written on
we
it?
we are nature defending itself.
Wow, that's really great. So maybe if you don't mind starting with that project, that art. So when did you make it and who are involved in the process?
So um first 2 weeks, first week of November, I went to Oaxaca, to the anti-COP that was um organized kind of between COP 16 on biodiversity and COP 29 on climate change.
Yeah.
And I actually only realized this week that there is now third COP on combating desertification, which is starting next week.
Yes.
But so yeah, the week in between the first two COPs, we had an anti-COP in Oaxaca. And so I took the letters, I had them cut out, but they weren't attached, and took the fabric.
Right.
And so like it was so busy. It was crazy. I was talking to friends about it just yesterday,
Yeah.
and we all met people that the other people didn't even see. There were only 200 of us there. I can't imagine what an actual COP is like.
Yeah.
Um, um, but yeah, so there was one time when we had an actual workshop,
Yeah.
but the rest of the time it was just like in the corners after lunch, after breakfast.
Right.
You want to stitch a little while, and people would join in, and
Yeah.
there we have it.
You mentioned it's part of the anti-COP. Do you maybe want
Yes.
to tell us what it does?
So it's the first time I've been to an anti-COP, but I think there have been different processes of resistance to the COP processes, um, probably almost as long as they've existed.
All right. Yeah.
Um, COP COP 29 is now over. COP 30 is the next one coming. We've been doing this for 30 years,
Yeah.
and climate change, all the indicators of climate change are just getting worse, not better.
That's true. It's
So,
quite,
essentially,
yeah, those like
if,
international
if
conferences.
exactly, the UN process feels like it's not really working. There's always voices that say, so for example, the COP 29, I haven't had enough time to really read about how it went, but from what I've seen, I get the impression that lots of things, that there were some agreements. It was called the finance COP because they were supposed to agree very ambitious financing for development going forwards without fossil fuels, and obviously that hasn't really been achieved. The whole event started with the president of Azerbaijan, which is the host country this year, saying that all resources, including fossil fuels,
God.
are a gift from God.
I think it's just so
um,
ridiculous for someone to make this kind of remark in a conference that exactly against this.
I think people are coming from really, really different realities. That man just doesn't understand what we're coming from, and he doesn't care that large parts of tropical Africa are going hungry because they haven't been able to have a proper crop, and goodness knows how many years because of climate change already.
Yeah.
Um, or he's never going to have a hurricane. Azerbaijan is never going to be hit by a coastal hurricane, um, or a cyclone,
Yeah.
or even raising sea levels much. And yeah, no, it doesn't have a coast, Azerbaijan, apart from the Caspian Sea, which isn't connected to one of the oceans, so it's not going to have sea level rise.
Right. Yeah.
Um, I mean, I'm sure there are consequences to climate change. I've never been to Azerbaijan, but I'm sure there are issues. Forest fires could be a threat. Um, Melting glaciers. I mean, there could be there must be loads of issues, but he's just coming from a completely different place. He lives in a country that is and has been completely dependent on oil for goodness knows how many generations, and it is unfathomable to me that somebody like that or a government like that could be put in charge of a COP that's supposed to be doing something about climate change. Um, the one before was similar in that it was also a petrostate,
The UAE.
um, the UAE exactly. So essentially, the anti-COP, enough talk of COPs, is a group of people who work in different forms of activism, looking for alternatives, because that process just doesn't seem to be fit for purpose, as they say these days. Um, it's just not doing what it needs to do. There was during COP29 a whole group of high level diplomats also wrote a letter to the UN saying that this isn't working, it's not fit for purpose, we need to shake this up and do something different, but they haven't, and I don't think they know how. They don't know what needs to be shaken up. Even the people writing the letter don't have a clear image. you know um I listened to a podcast called Outrage and Optimism with Christiana Figueres and two other blokes whose names I always forget, who were all involved in the Paris Agreement, and it's a great podcast. Sometimes I think they're a bit too apologist for the complexities of international diplomacy. I mean, I get it. I get it. International diplomacy is difficult, but climate change is worse.
That's true.
It just isn't happening fast enough. So the anti-COP, it was it was really cool. There were lots of very young people. I was like the old lady. My friends laugh at me when I say that, but yeah, I don't think there were that many people older than me. And so it's a very different feel. We were eating local food, and we were staying in an indigenous, um well, I mean, it is a native community, but we were actually staying within a like an organization that hosts and belongs to indigenous communities. They had dry toilets. Lots of people didn't know how to use dry toilets. So the
Oh,
women's dry toilets were routinely blocked because people didn't get how it worked, which was actually a really interesting reflection on how you can get to a point in your activism and still find that completely new. It really brought home to me how all our paths to our destination are so different.
yeah.
Um, and so there were four main themes that we had, like working tables on. I'm not going to remember all four of them now. One was mega projects and extractive industries. One was the water crisis. Another one was the how do you say that in English? The like monetization of life, something like that.
Yeah.
And what was the fourth one? Okay, it escapes me. But essentially, every day we would have meetings and we would talk about these things and come to conclusions. I can send you the final results. It's kind of cool. And in the end, I don't know what's going to happen next. I don't know how much we're going to connect, but I think it's the beginning of a process, at least in Latin America, to organize something outside the next COP, to try and make visible how it's just not working fast enough. It's
Yeah.
just not working.
That's totally true. Like I remember in this COP29 during one of the sessions where they were talking about the financing problem, and some of the heads of the developing countries and activists, they just worked out of the conference room talking that they are here to talk about the issues too, but they are not feel like being.
Yeah,
Yeah. And I also noticed that your project, the Forest of Hope, was in COP26 in Glasgow, right?
that's right. Yes,
How was
there
that?
was. Um, so I started running local workshops in 2016, just like me and whatever friend I could convince to come with me that day. Um, and initially, we would just take our old clothes and a sewing machine and invite people to make something new. And it was like an excuse, like a just like a platform to begin to talk about how really lots of stuff that goes in the bin isn't rubbish and actually is a perfectly good um, raw material for something. And then so you could move on to all the ways we damage the environment and a bit of climate change. It's just I found it really difficult to engage somebody on the street about climate change and basically say, yeah, you're walking along with your 6-year-old daughter. Who knows what the world's going to look like? Where's she going to live? What's she going to eat? How's she going to work? It's like, it's really hard. And people are like, yeah, don't want to listen to you. Whereas if you are doing something that's actually quite fun and that gives you satisfaction, you learn something, you reconnect with something that maybe your mother did or your grandmother did, and you end up with this pretty thing that you can take home as a reminder of that nice activity that you did, then it's actually really easy to say, isn't it amazing all the stuff that people throw in the bin that they don't need to, that they could turn into beautiful things? And then other subjects can flow from that.
Yeah.
And so that's how I started. And in early 2020, I'd got my first tiny bit of funding to run workshops.
At
And
the
then we had the pandemic. And so the funding was from the city of Mexico City, the secretary, so the Ministry of Culture or something, I guess is what it would be. And so they asked us to do our workshops online. And at first I was really like, oh, how am I going to teach people to sew online? It's like, can you see my hands? Can you see what I'm doing? And well, we learned a lot. It was a steep learning curve. We learned to film ourselves so that we could, like pre-edit some of the tutorial bits. And then people could do the activity while we were present and they could ask questions. But, we were able to focus on the things that needed to be seen. And it was actually a really beautiful community. We were bonkers. We did like 56 workshops over 5 and a bit months. And we should never have done that many because it was like even the funding didn't really cover it. We got paid about 20 cents a minute or an hour. So, but it was a beautiful process because 2 or 3 times a week, all these people who were shut in and at that time didn't really have that many other nice activities to go to were coming together. And because it was online, it wasn't even just Mexico City. There were people from all over Mexico, there were people from Argentina, people from lots of other countries. And when the workshop came to an end, several of them said, "Hey, but why is this going to stop? This is really cool." And I was exhausted. I was like, "Well, I'm not going to run any more workshops actually, but um, but why don't we do it as a collective?" And so we started in 2021. We had monthly meetings and we started talking about how we could do what did it mean to be a collective and how could we do something together if we were in 4 different countries, and there were 14 of us at the time. And and it kind of came and went and we talked, we had ideas, and we came to the conclusion that we would do something for COP26. And at that time, we had no idea how we were going to get to COP26 or what, how that was going to pan out.
And
But
wondering, like at that time, how big your group was, like before COP26.
well, there were 14 of us in that chat. There were more who had been coming to the workshops, but in the end, the WhatsApp group was made of the people who came to the very, very last meeting or who hadn't had to leave early from that meeting because it was like a last minute, oh, let's do this and stay in touch. Like it wasn't really planned. But there were 14 of us. And we decided to stitch a forest. But how do 14 women in 4 different countries and more cities, because at least 6 or 7 different cities, how do they stitch a forest together? How do you do a creative piece of artwork that is totally physical from more than 7 different locations? And the conclusion was, do I have one that I can show you? I probably do. Um, the conclusion was that we created a guide. So all of our trees were 30 by 60 centimeters big, and they had buttons and buttonholes. So we each created our tree that had meaning for us. That was, the tree that my dad planted when I was a child, or the tree that I've been watering in a public space for the last 5 years, or whatever.
Yeah. What
And
kind
the
of
idea was that, pardon?
what kind of tree did you do? Did you do like in
I don't have mine. It's because it's in Argentina now. But I that first one was a mahogany tree, and not a very not biologically accurate mahogany tree with a red howler monkey hanging out of it. I worked in the rainforest in Peru, and I thought that was like it was one of the moments when I started thinking about trees in a different way. Um, And the idea was that when we managed to bring all the trees together, we would be able to attach them with the buttons and the buttonholes. And instead of being individual trees, they would become a forest. And um, so we all got stitching. And we didn't really know how we were going to make it happen, but we all got stitching. And we posted it on our social media, which was maybe 2,000 followers, not very many. And people started joining and connecting and saying, I want to do a tree too. And so we wrote the instructions on our website, and we made some videos and stuff. And well, we had 3 months to receive everything before COP. And in those 3 months, I got 157
that's
embroideries from 10 different countries. It was
yeah.
amazing.
And I also knew that it's like a wide range of ages, like and also people from different walks of life.
Yeah.
That's
Yeah. It's
amazing. Yeah.
yeah, it was quite amazing. It was quite amazing. So there are very humble people who are like cleaners and things like that. And there are doctors and lawyers and activists and architects, academics.
Yeah.
It's really, really broad range. And the youngest at the time, I think, was 9, and the oldest was like 87. She's in her 90s now.
So how do you think like what made this project like reach this like demographic of people?
Um, I think it was the world was in a really depressing place. And just like the workshops that I'd been running the year before, this was a space of hope, right? And a space where you could meet people, a safe space where you could learn or you could talk about things that felt like they were meaningful and useful, and you could do something that was at one level. I mean, you've probably heard about how stitching and knitting and lots of these I don't want to belittle it or reduce it, but some of these very simple, almost ancestral, not almost, but actually ancestral activities, they have an element of, they calm you down. You're sitting there and you can focus on this thing in your hands, and you can't control what's happening outside, you can't control COVID, you can't control climate change, but you are in control of this piece of fabric in your hands. And I really don't know. I really don't know. Like I grew up at my grandmother used to do a lot of stitching and knitting and lots of things like that. And she died when I was 6, but she made me loads of things in that short time. And my mum is the generation that, uh, the women's lib the generation that didn't need to knit and didn't need to sew because there were loads of clothes in the shops, and she was an academic and she was an intellectual. And when something that we cared about broke, my mum knew how to fix it because she'd grown up with her mum. But it was like a chore. It wasn't something that she liked to do. And it took me at least 3 decades to come full circle and say, no, actually, I want to be like my granny. and
That sounds like a full.
and and un and unlearn the idea that it was boring to sew. My mum still, she sees me stitching and she's like, "What are you doing? Are you doing? Oh, it's very pretty, but what are you doing?"
Yeah, I can totally relate to this. Like when I was little, my grandma used to make like a lot of my sweaters, but I just now I
Mm.
obviously grew out of them. And also my mom
Yeah.
has picked up like some of the techniques. So whenever she used to do all the like stitches on my clothes and things like this. But like for us, this generation, I think it's kind of a lost skill.
Uh-huh.
Yeah.
And yet, when people actually stop and do it, they discover that benefit. Um, we just before the pandemic, in fact, we had started taking embroideries, like collective embroideries, out onto the streets in public parks, and as a way of getting people to talk again. Just any excuse to talk about climate change because people seem so unaware. And and we had one of a red macaw because they're not considered endangered globally, but in Mexico they used to be in loads of states. They used to be all over the country along the coast, not in the mountains, but like all along the coasts and in the jungles in the south. And now they think there are just two surviving viable populations, maybe only one. Um, so essentially, it's functionally extinct in most of Mexico, and it's a different subspecies to the one in the Amazon. So if this one goes, then it's gone. Um, and it's very beautiful. So you sit there in the street and you invite people to come and give a few stitches for nature, and you tell them that story, and they're like, "Wow, really? Why?" And and one day we were in the park, and a man came by with his grandson. We were like, "Oh, come and sit down." He was like, "No, no, no, I'm in a terrible rush. I've got to leave my grandson at Scouts." And so they ran off. And 5 minutes later, he comes back without the child. And we were like, "Oh, you're not in a hurry anymore. Come and sit down." He was like, "I'm rubbish. I can't do anything artistic. My teacher in first grade told me I was useless." We were like, "Goodness, what a horrible teacher you had, but do sit down." And he did sit down.
Okay.
And the first 8 stitches that he tried to stitch, he unthreaded the needle. Like he would just keep pulling the needle until there was no thread. And we were like, "No, no, no, calm down, calm down." And then after that, he did, like, he finished this line of stitching and he stopped when he ran out of thread and he was like, "Thank you. I'm so glad I sat down with you. I had no idea." And it's just like, I think human beings are manual creatures. Like, so much about how we've evolved has to do with what we can do with our hands. And the reality is that most people today don't use them, really. We sit at computers, we we use our hands, but we don't really make things with our hands anymore. Um, the majority of us. And I think there's some kind of, I don't know, physiological brain hand thing going on that really gives us peace. Maybe not everybody, but probably easily 80% of the population
Yeah.
would really, really need something. And I mean, I studied anthropology and public health. Nobody told me I could be an artist. And it's taken me a long time to feel like I can even say that, you know. But that's why I'm here, because I really found peace making things.
Yeah. So what like prompted you to like maybe approach climate change from an art approach? Is there like any moment that clicked that you were like, yes, this is something that I think is gonna make a difference?
I think there's probably lots of little moments. So when I finished university, I went with some friends to the Amazon, and we had like a summer project to work with a community who who had been relatively recently contacted, just 16 years before, and they had lots of issues with illegal loggers in their territory. And in our innocence and our idealism, we were like, oh, if we write a report about what the problem is, then the Ministry of Agriculture will sort it all out. And the reality is that they're still very far from being sorted, but for us it was an extraordinary moment. Like I'd never been in a rainforest before, and so we ended up staying several years in Peru. We founded a like equivalent of a kind of charity organization, an NGO, and we carried on working with that community and other nearby communities on territorial issues. We helped them make their own maps of their territory so that they could tell the petrol companies to take a running jump because that land was in use, things like that. And and while that was happening, I came back to England to visit my parents one time, and my mum said, there's loads of old broken clothes in your cupboard. Can you just deal with them and put them in the bin? And so I started taking them out of the cupboard, and like, well, yeah, they're really broken, but I don't want to throw them away because we have like, oh, this was the trousers that I was wearing when I did this, and this was the shirt. And I just have a nice feeling about this. And so I started cutting them up into squares and sewing them together without really knowing anything, all by hand. I had no sewing machine. I had no intention of getting a sewing machine. I was just like, and when I went back to Peru, I took my pile of squares with me and I carried on stitching the occasional square. And I would hang them up on the wall and look at them. And well, long story short, a friend of mine did eventually sit me down at a sewing machine and say, "You're going to take 100 years to finish this. Look, this is how the sewing machine works." And that was my first quilt, and I really enjoyed making it. Um, and then a few years later, I became really disillusioned in Peru because the Federation leader sold his people to the petrol company. We don't know for a fact, but he was almost certainly paid off, and he worked for the company for years afterwards. So I was really disappointed. It was a rude awakening, and I went to what my I speak English like I grew up in England because I did grow up in England, but my parents are from Argentina,
Right.
and so when that happened, and I was in crisis, I ended up deciding to go to Argentina for 6 months as a kind of I don't know, a place of rest, a place to recover. And I became an apprentice to a leather worker. And so for several months, I would tootle off to his house every afternoon and learn to make things in leather. And and so that was like the beginning of me realizing how important it is for almost like for my mental health to be making things. um, and then lots of things happened in my life. I met my husband, then had children, time passed, I mended their clothes, I started making some clothes. Um, and then,
Your children's reaction to this? Like you're trying to stitch the clothes back.
well, like little children, their mother's just the way she is. So, like, oh, yeah, obviously, that must be the normal thing to do. Like, when they get older, they realize that nobody else has patchy clothes and they start to reflect. But when they're 3, it's just like normal. And if mummy gave it to me, it must be the best thing in the world. It's delightful. If you ever have children, do all these crazy, wacky things when they're really small because afterwards it becomes much harder.
Yeah.
Like, now I only wear clothes in this style, in this color, and therefore your thing is weird. But no, in the beginning, so there was just like I had twins and we had 2 older children with my husband, so there were 4 of them. So it was pretty busy time, and I didn't work for several years. And and then yeah, so I'd been doing quite a bit of making stuff, but it was just a hobby. And my friend said to me, "Why don't you give a workshop of that?" And I was like, "Oh, nobody will listen to me. Nobody will be interested. It's just me and my nutty hobby." And in fact, we set up a table with our two sewing machines and literally our old clothes from home. And there was a line of people waiting for their turn. I was blown away. So that was basically the beginning of Surciendo el Planeta, which means darning the planet.
Yeah.
So it's like lots of little things that um, that got me to a point almost by accident where, oh, well, now that we're all so happy, we can actually talk about why we think it's important to do this. And the reason we think this is important is because we're in a climate emergency.
Right. Yeah.
Um, and all our priorities are wrong, and we should stop buying so many clothes. And in fact, the companies that make the clothes should stop making so many clothes.
Exactly. Yeah.
And therefore, the skills that we're teaching you here about how you could mend them or how you could turn them into something else are really, really important because sooner or later it's going to happen anyway. It could happen nicely if they voluntarily stop making all their shit, or we could really keep going into crisis and then goodness knows how it's going to be.
Yeah.
Um, so yeah, that's the process. It wasn't like a light bulb moment. It was very gradual, and I felt this very clearly with the forest project as well. Lots of the time you have to start something. You just have to start, and you don't know where you're going exactly because you kind of discover the route as you go along. You discover the possibilities, and like that in my wildest dreams, I did not imagine that more than 140 women would send embroideries in 2021. I when we talked about it, we were like, well, there are 14 of us. So at least we'll have 14 trees because all 14 of us are definitely going to stitch a tree. And somebody would say, oh, well, I think I could probably manage two. Okay, perfect. Well, there'll be 15. Or maybe somebody else. I'm going to ask my friend and so, and maybe we'll get to 20. 20 would be amazing. And if anybody reads our post online, maybe we'll get an extra 10. Wow, 30 would be brilliant. Okay, 30, 30. I'll just roll them up and put them in my rucksack. I'll get on. I was in France that year. I was confined in France during the pandemic. I'll get on a train and I'll go to Glasgow. I'll just carry my 30 embroideries in my backpack. In the end, with 157 and some banners that fit into the forest, um, I had a huge suitcase and a huge rucksack.
Yeah. I can imagine.
But yeah, that just it really I was completely convinced. I'd already made lots of changes in the way that we live at home and things that we do because of the climate emergency. But that experience of community and connecting with all these people that we really didn't know, like even the ones that lived in our same city, lots of the time we hadn't met them because we were all still in pandemic. That was amazing. That was really, really amazing. And I think it was that was a key moment in terms of community building for me. It really changed something because until that had happened, like the workshops that I'd been giving on the streets before, it was always different people. You never saw the same person twice, or hardly ever. Occasionally, you saw the same person twice, and so it was like you had a conversation, and then they went off into the world, and you never knew whether it made a difference. And with the workshops in 2020, where the same people kept coming back, and the tree stitching in 2021, where the same people kept coming back, and we would meet every week, and we would talk about issues, and we did some techniques like sort of Rob's imagination thing. What is the future that we imagine? What's the future that we want these trees to live in? Um, and it's actually we wrote. I do Rob's book. If not, what's it called? from what it is it called What If from What If to What Next, or is that the podcast? But in the book, he starts off describing a walk, you know, how he takes his kids to school and he does this and he does that, as if the future,
Yeah.
everything has been done that can be done. And so there's a public transport everywhere and bikes and hardly any cars and vegetables growing everywhere and things like this. And so we wrote ourselves a letter from the future. It's on our website somewhere. I'm not sure if it's in English. Some we've translated. We're working on translating. Here we go. Guarda el futuro. But I'm not sure if this one's in English yet. A letter from the future that we desire. Oh yes, it does appear to be in English. A letter from the future we want. I'll pop it in the chat.
Sure.
And it was really interesting because there were people in completely different geographies. And so everybody was thinking about their own city. So the final letter, which tries to include what everybody was saying, is really wacky. Like Mexico City has more than 50 rivers, and they've all been stuck into pipes and turned into the drainage system. So they're full of shit, literally. And I really remember, because it was about water, one of the other ladies was in Rosario in Argentina, and they were going through a really, really bad, like one of the worst droughts that they'd had in years. And Rosario is a really important port city on one of the biggest rivers in South America. Well, the second biggest after the Amazon. And the boats were having a hard time getting into port, and the islands in the river were on fire. Lots of them deliberately set fire to them, and so she was describing this enormous, monstrous river, and we were like, yeah, well, the rivers in the highlands of Mexico are a bit different, but yeah, we put them all in together because it was like this collective vision.
Yeah.
So you can have a read. And so that experience of sharing was really, really, really powerful, really powerful. And that enabled me the following year, or yeah, about a year and a little over a year later, to try and start an urban garden here in Mexico City. I live in a really conservative neighborhood where, you know, in the beginning of the pandemic, I had offered my neighbors free composting workshops, and on a neighborhood chat where everybody's like, oh, my niece is making cakes. Anybody want them? And you get 101 people going, thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you. And I offered them free composting workshops, and nobody even answered, like not even no thank you. It's just like silence. And so I was convinced that they were all idiots and that there was no way that they were going to do anything. Oh, did it freeze? Can you hear me?
Yes.
And then so after this experience of with the forest, a friend of mine said, no, put it on Twitter, and we'll retweet it. And there were some people with a lot of Twitter followers. And so I put out a tweet that said, if you'd like to be part of an urban garden in this neighborhood, come to this place at this time and let's talk about it. And these multi-thousand people followers retweeted it, and 16 people showed up to our meeting. I was, again, the population is, like more than 80% of most national populations believe that looking after the climate or looking after the environment is more important than making money. And yet that isn't really happening. And lots of the time, people don't think that it's something they can do. I mean,
Yeah.
We can't stop Coca-Cola from selling and extracting water and making plastic bottles at an individual level. But if we don't do something at an individual level, then we don't have enough power as individual consciousnesses to make global societal changes, right? Because I mean, I've never liked Coca-Cola. I never liked it even as a child. So it's not difficult for me at all to avoid buying it. And I realize that there are some people who are essentially addicted to it and think it's part of their well-being to be able to drink Coca-Cola. It's their right to be able to choose to drink Coca-Cola. And so I'm obviously this nasty authoritarian person who's coming to tell them that they shouldn't drink Coca-Cola or fizzy drinks. And that makes it really difficult, right? So if we're not doing something, whatever it is, like, your urban garden or your super recycling or learning to have a dry toilet in your house or doing something, then you have no process by which to gradually change the way you think about the things around you. So, people believe that it's that working towards having a car to be able to drive around the city in comfort and in peace is more important than the right to clean air. I have that conversation with my oldest son who really wants to buy a car. I mean, we do have one family car, which we bought in theory so that we could get out of the city, all six of us. So it would be full and it would be a way of escaping. Um, and we share it between all of us. I don't really think he needs another car, but you know, who is his mother to say that?
I think it's like, for example, if you wait till the moment when people suddenly realize that there's this huge climate crisis, and then they started to make behavior changes, it's gonna be too late. So I do think the earlier we start the conversation, the better.
Yeah, no, absolutely, absolutely.
Yeah,
I, th
like
I think I think it takes so many changes in our individual lives. Like we're so used to doing things in certain ways, right? Like um, really anything that we have, like a phone, um, there's so much intrinsic environmental damage involved in the making of a phone, which we all consider absolutely necessary, and I can't remember what I was listening to the other day, but they were talking about electricity as this basic necessity. Human beings have been around for hundreds of thousands of years. For 99.9% of that time, we did not have electricity. It is not really, it's not a basic necessity. It's not food, it's not clothing, it's not shelter, it's not community. But it's now this has completely overtaken the sense of real community, right? I don't know, in Mexico at the moment, like in the last few weeks, there's been a little kind of video meme that's been going around, which is a graph which claims to show, it doesn't say what the source of the information is, but it claims to show how the percentage of our time spent on different things has changed over the last 100 years. And so it starts like in the 1930s, and the things at the top of the graph with the most percentage of our time are family and friends and neighbors, I think. And then the other categories are like work and school and church and goodness knows what. And the last one, which is at zero in 1930, is time online. And so, time starts to run and the columns all change places, and the whatever's got the highest number goes to the top. And then in the 90s, the internet starts to grow, and then it suddenly shoots up past everything else. And then it becomes like this thing that takes up 60% of our time. And everything else, family and friends and neighbors and school and everything's just like this almost irrelevant amount of time. Um, and that transformation in the way that we do things. So like if the four things that are actually essential to our lives are food and water, obviously, um, shelter, clothing, and community, and we think we're in community when we're on the phone, but we're not really. It doesn't really give us that kind of closeness. So
I feel like
yeah,
a lot of the pictures I've seen posted online on the Instagram page, they're all like people gathering together to do the embroidery or some or things like this. I think
yeah,
it's really good sense to create this like offline community.
that's what we try. And it's also really slow because when you're online, you think you can be in three different conversations at once and you're kind of doing 100 things. I don't think that's very good for mental health either. And the expectation that you can do that is only possible because we have petro-powered energy, right? So going slow is like going back to the speed of the human brain, the human body, and um and just sitting and chatting for a little while.
Yeah.
So I think there's a lot of it that's actually, and we don't talk about it that much, but a lot of it is about well-being,
Yeah.
really allowing yourself to stitch to be well. And since you're well, then we can have this conversation about climate change,
Yeah.
right? So maybe we need to make that more explicit
Yeah.
because I know that we all feel it. The and one of our friends in Argentina right now is accompanying her ex who has leukemia. So he has lots and lots of treatments, and she's spending a lot of time sitting in waiting rooms, and she's got her stitching with her. It's a kind of
Yeah.
being at peace.
Yeah. I think this is something that's really important. Like a lot of time because we have phone on our hand, we have like this flood of informations coming at us. And
Yeah,
sometimes it does feel like quite a relief or like even something that's anti-anxiety if we just like put our phone away and really spend time with the family and talk to them or just maybe just have a walk with them. This is something that
yeah,
I really like I just started like really consciously doing, and I do think it's really wonderful to try to like rebuild this kind of connections with people around me. I think it's a really like a positive change, like particularly mentally. And I think this does matters, and because the climate change, if someone's really looking into it, it's gonna have some like negative impact
mhm,
on their mental health. So I think it's important that people really sit down and talk about it. I think you mentioned in one of the videos that sometimes in those 2 hour session workshop, it's not just about the process of making the art, it's about a community, people gathering together to
yeah,
talk about the issues that they're really concerned about. Yeah.
yeah, yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
Absolutely,
Yeah.
absolutely.
Like sometimes for me, because I just graduated from a master program in climate change, and one of the things that I've discussed a lot with my classmates is sometimes the climate change, the climate crisis can feel like too distant issues. Sometimes we feel like it probably is something that for the climate engineers or the people making the policies, the scientists to do, and just sometimes we just feel like less empowered to take actions. But I think it's particularly because of something like this that prevent a lot of individuals to take action. But in fact, there are smaller things like stitching, like to prevent those fabrics from just going to the landfills and reuse them can make a big influence. And especially it's like very open to conversation. It's the skill that people can bring home, like can bring home to their families, to their friends. That's how like it's gonna have bigger like kind of ripple effect across society. I think it's just something that people didn't really realize.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. I think people are paralyzed.
Yeah.
Um, so they don't know how to start. They don't know where to start. They don't know how to make a compost. They don't know how to start a community garden. They don't know how to mend their clothes. They don't know, like we're so in our era, as it were, that when my clothes are broken and I can't go to work with broken clothes, well, actually, if they're jeans, I'd probably buy them broken. Ah, so the world is really upside down. But yeah, so there's this kind of, like, we've been educated, not even educated by our parents, but the publicity out there is teaching us that the thing that is normal is to buy more, buy new, have more, keep filling the wardrobe until you can't actually see anything because it's so full of shit. And it's very hard because there's so much power in that voice that is fueled by the wealthy corporations teaching us that we need to consume more stuff, consume more energy. It's extraordinary to me that even like from when I was a child in the 1980s to now, the energy consumption per person has increased so much. I don't have the figures, but it's gone up so much. And I don't feel like in the 80s I lived uh, a deprived life because I wasn't using energy. But obviously, I didn't have a phone. My parents didn't have a like apart from the one that was actually plugged into the wall, and my parents didn't have a computer. I think we got our first computer in the mid 90s. You know, but all of those things are drains on energy consumption. There were relatively less gadgets, but life was fine. We really don't need the gadgets. And you know, 150 years ago, there weren't any electronic gadgets and life was fine.
Yeah.
So, so obviously, if you tell somebody, if you start the conversation there with someone, you're like, okay, we have this climate emergency, so everybody's going to stop using electric gadgets. Then they're never going to listen to you.
Yeah.
Then you can't start the conversation at that point. I don't even know if that is. They say that the environmental movement's early messaging was really really bad because it was all about how we need to live, we need to suffer more to save the environment, and obviously that didn't go down well with anybody, and nobody outside the environmental movement joined the movement because they wanted to suffer more.
Yeah.
um but actually I think a lot of slowing down. A friend of mine in Canada spent several weeks one winter without electricity because power lines collapsed because
Right.
of winter storms. And she says that, you know, it was the coldest months of the year and there was no TV, there was no electricity, there was no heating, and everybody was shivering in their houses. But every evening they would meet up, and by candlelight they would play cards, and everybody like they had this. They would play board games, they would hang out, they would have a warm drink together, and then they would all go home and go to bed. And the day the electricity came back, everybody stayed home and watched telly. And she really felt how that community just vanished. So actually, although we perceive that the withdrawal of electric energy would be a huge impact on our quality of life, in some ways, it might improve our quality of life. We might actually go out there and meet our neighbors and rebuild a community.
Yeah.
In a way, having all this electricity is in the way. And we don't realize it because we think that it's a great benefit and this very modern thing that makes us live well. And so that's a really difficult message to work against, unless you have 3 hours of stitching where you can work into the corners of the complicated issues and really talk about personal experiences.
Yeah. And I remember, I think it's Rob Hopkins who talked about the transition movement. It's less like a traditional type of movement. It's more like a street party. Like you get to know your neighbors better.
Yeah.
They are really they're actually a very nice guy. So I think this is really something
Yeah.
that different.
Yeah, I have to say, since I started the community garden here, I've got to know so many more people and so much more about the history of the neighborhood.
Yeah.
Um, it's crazy. I'd lived here for 8 years and I knew nothing. And in a year and a half, I'm like, oh, wow. So yeah, absolutely. I totally agree with that.
Yeah. Yeah, but I think it's just hard for people to really take the step to do this. For example,
Yeah,
like electricity, like blackout.
yeah, yeah. People really feel that loss of I mean, it's normal because we get used to the way that things are, and these are habits that we have established in the last two generations. But if you know that for the previous 100,000 generations, we didn't need any of that, but we've lost all the skills to live like that. You know, even the contrast between in Mexico City, there's still thousands of communities, tens of thousands of communities that live much more simply than in the cities. The majority of the population in Mexico already live in urban areas, but there are still tens of thousands of communities that are much more connected to the land and that have much more understanding of the land and that still have lots of these skills. You know, they can start a fire really, really like incredibly quickly. Like I can start a fire, but when you're in the community and they're like, oh, there it goes, you're like, it would take me 10 minutes to get that going.
Oh, yeah.
But it's practice, you know. And so somebody who's lived in the city and has always just turned on the gas, they're just not going to be able to start a fire. These are fundamental basic human skills. You know, literally for hundreds of thousands of years, human beings have been starting fires in order to cook the woolly mammoth or whatever.
Yeah.
But we don't know how to do that anymore. And I think in a country like Mexico and all of Latin America, there are still really, really big contrasts between what you might find in a rural or indigenous community and the way that we're living in cities. I think in Europe, even the rural, like there is a difference, but even the rural areas have most of the same services as and in Mexico, that's really, really still not true in terms of electricity, water supply, education, lots of things like that are very, very different in rural areas. Health services, for example, too.
Yeah.
So that's also a social justice issue, and I think social justice is underlies everything about climate change. I was at like a Christmas fair last weekend, and I was kind of appalled. It was a very commercial Christmas event. We were selling things made of recycled fabrics, and we didn't do that well because it was clearly not the right public, not the public that was interested in our stuff. And there was so much plastic tat being sold and plastic tat decoration and all these, you know, like these inflatable Father Christmases on airplanes. You're like, who needs that? And why did anybody even think of making that thing? And the only reason that they make it is because the industrial processes run by petro energy make it really cheap to make that thing. It's actually, well, I think it's super ugly, but it's also just sitting there probably for about 50 days with energy pumping, like it needs to be constantly inflated. So you can hear the little machine going. Like I mean, I don't know if you've ever seen them. I don't think I've seen them
Yeah.
much in England, but they use them a lot in wealthier districts of Mexico City. I think they come from the US.
Right.
And they're so pointless. And the only reason, so like people wouldn't buy stuff from us because they were like, oh, that's really pretty. But we would tell them the price, we set the prices because of how long it takes to make a thing, right? And so if it's made of patchwork, it takes longer because there's all these pieces that you had to piece together. It's not like just going to a fabric shop and sticking the two pieces that you need to make a bag. It's actually got like 20 or 30 pieces. And so they won't buy anything from us, but they will go and buy the plastic Superman wrapped in plastic in a plastic box with cardboard packaging and all this. And the reason that plastic Superman is cheaper than the thing that we made is because they didn't pay the people who made the plastic Superman probably a living wage. And so that social injustice plays into the environmental disaster or environmental injustice because if it wasn't so cheap to get the petrol out of the ground, or if it wasn't subsidized, and if it wasn't so cheap and easy to exploit workers, then they couldn't make this cheap tat, and then they couldn't sell it, and then it wouldn't exist, and then there wouldn't be a rubbish problem. It's just like this chain of how the whole structure of society is broken.
Yeah. And I think it's just always like the business, the company that's in the middle trying to make a profit from the gap of the price between both sides. And it's just horrible to look at some of the like very poor working condition for a lot of the
Yeah,
factory workers.
absolutely. Absolutely. I think that's like I don't know how we got to this point where it's justifiable for these people to report um massive gains every year when their workers aren't being paid a living wage. It's obscene. How is it okay for the CEO to have a swimming pool and a private tennis court in his house, in his mansion, whereas his workers can barely get to the end of the week and put food on the table every day? That's just not okay. And I think in a way it has a lot to do with how lots of labor has been outsourced to other countries. Because when it was within country, like there's a we take the United States as one of the biggest consumers as a country. There was a very strong campaign in the early 20th century of textile workers, women textile workers, who were initially from the 1800s already exploited. But in the early 1900s, they started unionizing, they started protesting, and actually labor laws became much, much stronger. And it was only after the Second World War that the US started exporting lots of the labor to Southeast Asia. And therefore, they undermined their own textile industry. Lots of those unionized women ended up losing their jobs because they couldn't compete. I think after the Second World War, like almost all the clothes in the US were made in the US. And by the late 70s and 80s, that drops to like less than 50%. And now I think it's like 3% of the clothing that you can buy in the US is made in the US. Um, I mean, at this point, the situation for workers in Southeast Asia is much more serious than for workers in the US. But the point is that they were exporting because the labor was so much cheaper because there were no labor laws in lots of those other countries. And that, you know, you can't only look at a local issue. This is it's really, really complex. The problem with our society has now become so complex that it's kind of difficult to grasp.
Right.
But because we all get dressed, working with fabric also allows you to talk about lots of things.
Yeah. Wow. Yeah. And I think this also is something probably like, for example, the author globalization, the movement like this is also against like how those people at the top, these 1% people are making the benefits out of those 99% of the working people. Yeah.
Yeah,
And
yeah,
also, yeah, like all the businesses, like with our phone, with our computer, they are like upgrading they're trying to upgrade the phones, the computers, trying to create the need that create a picture that
absolutely.
you need a new
Yeah.
phone. Yeah,
Yeah, that drives me bonkers as well.
yeah.
I don't like upgrading my phone, and now half my apps don't work because I haven't upgraded up whatever it's called, upgraded my operating system.
Also, like the businesses, like they have their like, I just find it so like disturbing when I learned that they have like the kind of planned obsolescence. Like they are
Yeah,
designed like that is designed to be outdated. It just
yeah, yeah, because they need you to go back and buy more.
right, yeah.
I'm really interested now. I think these economic issues are really important for us to understand. And I have to confess that for most of my life, economics has been like this area where I just don't get it. And it doesn't inspire me, so I get bored. I try and I start to read and I'm like, oh, so boring. But we need to understand and we need to have ways of talking about this because because the argument is yeah, you're so like into climate change and defending the environment. But what about money? Yeah, we all need money. And you're like, yeah, but we can't eat money. It's good. Like if we do everything for money, it what are we going to do next? You know, there's the famous Native American proverb when they've chopped down the last tree or when they've caught the last fish, that's when they'll realize that they can't eat money, things like this. Um, we need to be able to talk about this, and especially like lately, the I'm sure you've heard of the degrowth movement.
Yeah.
I think I think that's something that we need to be able to communicate to the general population much more. Because if you take it down to a much more local scale, so like a family restaurant doesn't need to have 12 different locations. If it's a good family restaurant and in one location it can make enough money to pay the salaries of the people who work there and a little extra for improvements and for repainting or redecorating once every 5 years and enough to fix things that break because stuff always breaks, you know, it doesn't need more than that. It just needs to keep itself going and make good food, obviously, feed people and make them happy. Whereas now that if you go to any business school, it's all about growing. Oh, you've got this super business model. Now make three more. And making three more is designed to make the owner earn three or goodness knows how many times more money, but not really look after the local community. Because if you have three different outlets in three different cities, you can't be involved with those three different communities. You can't be invested in the people being well and the food being looked after. And you can't keep an eye on the small details.
Yeah.
So, yeah, so this whole movement to make things more local um, has to go that way.
Yes. Yes, definitely. Like it's just simple as like money comes. But in a society where the business is in control, I don't think we can have this sentence. But it's exactly like what's happening with the town transition movement, that they are trying to keep the money flowing locally by having like
Uh-huh.
the kitchen, by having their like money in some towns. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. I really hope that next year we want to organize more workshops with a view to the forest growing. We want to go to COP30 in Berlin in Brazil, since it's on our continent now. And in theory, it's not going to be a petro state, although Brazil does have a petrol company and they have done a lot of drilling in the Amazon, which is a disaster as well. But yeah, so the what we want to do is create kind of guidelines, a little bit like some of the guides that I've seen on the transition website.
Right.
Kind of that gave me the idea, but sort of guidelines for how to start a sewing group, an embroidery group, and guidelines for initiating conversations. So like, yeah, now we've all got our projects, we're all going. You need a needle, you need thread, it's all here, and just sort of conversation starters.
Yeah.
And sometimes once the group is running, you might not need them. It might be enough to just say, "Oh my goodness, did you see what was in the newspaper about climate change? And have you heard of this?" And just let the conversation flow, because really that is what you need. But when you start, maybe you don't know how to get those conversations going. So we want to create those guidelines,
Yeah.
and we want to open the project to the entire world so that the forest isn't only Latin American, but African and Asian and everywhere.
Yeah.
And we're also hoping that like groups that are already doing stuff might come together to make collective pieces to show what communities are already doing, so that the Forest of Hope will actually have stories within it in a way that it hasn't had before. Because I think and then it would be like a foil, like showing up the COP, like, look, people on the ground with almost no money have already done all of this. And you guys, 30 years, and you still haven't done a shit. You know,
Yeah.
that's kind of the foil that we want to create. So yeah, hopefully our call for embroideries will be out in January. That's the plan.
Yeah. Really, really looking forward to it. Yeah, like
Where are you based?
what?
Where are you based?
And I'm in Beijing. I'm now in
Oh
Beijing and
wow.
it's my master in Bristol, UK.
Okay. Wow. Well, if you would like to organize an embroidery group, we would be very keen
I'd
to
lovely
have embroideries from.
love to do that, but I need to learn how to do that first.
Well, yeah. I mean, really, you don't need to know how to stitch. That's like, if you can push a needle into a fabric and out of a fabric, then that's all you need to know. The lots of people said to us, "Oh no, but I'm not very good at doing that." And there are in the that first round of the forest in 2021, there were people who were really into embroidery and were like super sophisticated, and then there were others who were environmentalists who'd never picked up a needle, but who really wanted to participate in something that was going to the COP. And so their first ever embroidery was their tree, and they sent it, and it went to the COP. And so like but that is, the trees that everybody made, they kind of represented themselves. And for me, that's really key to the whole story. We
Yeah.
can't we can't we can't decide that everybody has to be this way, like a sort of military action. We all have to approach climate change in this way. Everybody has to start from where they are and do what they can. And so, you know, different qualities and different, but not even qualities like that one's not so good and this one's really good, but just different uh, abilities.
Right.
That is where we are. That is how we are going to take our next step towards mitigating or adapting or reversing climate change.
Yeah, I think that
That's
kind of like the craftsmanship really matters. Like the thing that you make speaks for themselves, also speak for you, like what kind of person you are, the experience that the thoughts that you have put into the work. I think it's really
yeah,
meaningful, really something that I really want to be part of this. Yeah.
wonderful.
Yeah.
Join
Yeah, I think the time for this meeting is almost up, and I don't really want to keep you for too long.
us.
You're quite busy, so maybe just like try to wrap this up. Can you tell us maybe like if there's one message that you think is important that you want to share with us? Like it could be anything, it could be life, it could be environment, anything.
um, one message. Um, 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 um. There are so many things to say.
Oh, that it doesn't have to be one, just like
Yeah, I think we just have to keep it simple and like the worst thing is for people to think that there's nothing they can do. That like, well, I'll just carry on doing the things I do because the world's gonna be a disaster anyway. Like we really need to embrace our own agency in our communities, and there is so much that we can do,
yeah.
and at so many levels in so many different ways, even if that just means having a conversation with your neighbor or with somebody in the street. Even if that's the only thing you do, that is a thing that is worth doing.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for saying this. And thank you again for taking the time to do this. I think I really, really enjoyed it. And I think it's really
Wonderful.
inspiring for me, like to hear all of your stories and experiences is something that I know I just started working with the Transition Network, the communication team, but I
Uh-huh.
hope that it can last. That I think this conversation just reaffirms like how much I want to be committed to this. And I know there are like so many wonderful people like you who are doing like meaningful work. And I really appreciate this. And it's been a learning experience, a learning time for me to hear your stories. And yeah, thank you so much again for doing this amazing work.
Oh, thank you very much.
Yeah.
And you too.
Yeah. And
I think these networks are wonderful. Yeah, no, I think these connections and talking to different groups and getting different experiences, it makes you believe that you can do stuff. That's a bit like my experience of being in the collective and being able to create this enormous forest, giving me the belief that we could also have a communal garden. And so the next step is what am I going to believe in next? Because
yeah,
the more I do things, the more I believe in the possibility. We've got to be happy. Another thing that we always say is we've got to be happy doing what we're doing. Like you can't work on climate change if you're really depressed all the time. It's like, oh, it's going to be terrible. It's going to be terrible. Then you end up just like sitting under the table waiting for the terrible thing to happen. You have to have joy.
yeah,
Go out into the world and save it with joy.
yeah. I think that pretty much sums up the station. And thank you so much again for agreeing to do this and be our very first interview. And I really appreciate this. And hope we can
Wonderful.
be in touch. If there's anything I can do, like to be part of this, just let me know. I would love to be part of it.
Definitely. Well, let me get once we've got all our guidelines up on the website, I'll be in touch.
Yeah, sure. Thank you so much for this. And I
Wonderful.
think I'll just end the meeting.